I'm Debbie Georgatos. Welcome to my show, America Can We Talk? Today, we're going to talk about stages and shapes of tyranny, media, speech, banks and schools, COVID budget busters, and the Texas storm, climate change, and American goodness. Of course, I'll tell you why these stories matter to you. Stay tuned.
Debbie Georgatos, host of America Can We Talk, is an author, attorney, and political analyst whose mission is to inspire the American political conversation about preserving liberty in the best country on earth. America Can We Talk is sponsored by GC Works, a Dallas-based company performing advanced technology research in the oil and gas industry.
Hello again and welcome to America Can We Talk and to today's First Five. I'm Debbie Georgatos. I called this first segment, and I really want to dedicate all of today's show to talking about the idea of what should Americans consider to be tyranny, and are we seeing tyranny right now? And I called it this first little segment to introduce the idea of stages and shapes of tyranny. And everyone recognizes tyranny when we read about in history books. We read about things that happened in countries as, the Nazis took over and they began doing horrible things. They began requiring Jewish citizens to wear the gold star and then moving them around, only allowing them to live certain areas. We all know the whole story of the Holocaust. But the tyranny was very physical and the people could see it. They could see what was happening. And these kinds of things of tyranny have happened in other, not just Nazi Germany, but of course, other times that communists have taken over rule of countries. You see tyranny today, North Korea, Cuba, Venezuela, China, anywhere the government has absolute authority, and they do not honor the simple idea of the right of the individual to live in freedom. The whole premise of societies where tyranny is rampant is the idea that the government simply has not only the right, but the obligation to control all of society. And the tyranny then, when people step out of line, they don't want to comply with whatever it is, then the wrath of the government comes down on you. They have family members disappear during the night, all those things we read about in countries. And we always think in America, this is so great because America has so many built-in protections that those kinds of things won't happen here. We have the Constitution. We have rights guaranteed in the Constitution, spelled out. We talk about them many times on my show. The First Amendment especially, the right of freedom, the freedom of speech and assembly and worship, and all of these rights guaranteed to us, the Second Amendment, all of the rights. The premise of America's founding was we have these rights. And the existence of government, the purpose of government is to protect us and to protect those rights. This is novel in all of world history in creating a country based on those ideas, and it's still novel today. But we often don't recognize tyranny, or we don't like it called that, because we don't have people knocking on people's doors in the middle of the night and yanking people out of their homes and having them disappear for years on end. We're not rounding up the people of various race or ethnic groups and doing things to them. We just don't have that here. But what's happening in America today, and I talked about this long before the election results of November 2020, is the growing mindset of leftism in this country. The American, you can't even call today's left-wing party the Democrat Party. They have embraced a Marxist government-controlled, oriented thought about what America is, what their role is in government, what the right of the government is. The government is not there in the minds of the Democrat Marxist Party of today. The government's not there to protect your rights. The government is there to control the people, to make decisions for them, to force them to do what the government wants them to do. Part of tyrannical control in countries around the world is to silence opposition, is to say through some policy, some procedure, something they set up, you're simply going to disable the ability of your political opponents to get traction, to talk to each other, to meet together, to discuss their ideas. This idea of silencing political opposition and ultimately putting the fear into the hearts and minds of citizens that they may end up being targeted, arrested, harassed, in some other way harassed by the government because of their political views. This is a Tyranny Tactics 101 methodology is to begin to have the people in a country think, we're not allowed to say what we really think. We're not allowed to talk about these topics. We're not allowed to pursue this issue. We're not allowed to say this. We're not allowed to think this. It is a hallmark of tyranny when the government begins to take control of information people have access to, of what they can read about, what they can talk about, whether they can gather and talk about it, whether they can form organizations around ideas. America has been an extraordinary experiment in human liberty from its founding because of our commitment, our absolute commitment to the right of the individual to live in freedom. And I am doing the show today to talk with you about the idea of just what a dangerous place America is today in 2021 as we look forward to 4 years of a Biden administration and at least 2 years of the Democrat Marxist Party controlling the House and the Senate. And the reason I'm saying this is I want to alert people now to recognize how far we've come already in submitting to tyranny, into agreeing with ourselves. And this is not just tyranny about surrendering to the government's rules about COVID. I mean, that is a problem. The idea of how much we listen to the government and allow the government to control our freedom and our movements and our businesses and our lives under COVID is much deeper and much bigger than that. And that's what I want to talk about today. And I'll close out the first 5. I wanted to mention this person named Naomi Wolf. And I meant to send Matt the Wonderful a picture of her, but she was I didn't get around to that, but she was a Clinton era administration advisor, Naomi Wolf, Dr. Naomi Wolf. She also worked with Al Gore. She's a very, very pretty woman, and she's a doctor of I don't know what. She has a doctorate. Her name is Naomi Wolf. And she'd written a book several years ago talking about basically where America is in the scope of tyranny. Where are we? What you know? And she has through time, and her political commentary continues. She has continued to define what she has called the 10 steps to fascism. And these 10 steps to fascism, as she spells them out, she's talked about things, this Naomi Wolf talked about things that are, you know, she's a leftist for sure. I mean, she's a Clinton era, Al Gore supporting leftist. She wasn't wild about the Obama administration, but she was very much involved in the leftist mindset under Clinton. And so I want to just, and Al Gore. So what she says, be really clear, this is someone I would never agree with. What she lists out, when she starts her description of 10 steps to fascism, and she runs through, you can read her book if you want to, but she runs through what she's calling the ways societies can shift away from freedom and end up in fascism. And she describes what she sees. Step 1 is invoking a terrifying internal, external enemy. Well, she says, ISIS was a real enemy, so it was okay to talk about them. But before I go through these, I'll say her point in all of the other first 9, as she's talking today about her 10 steps of fascism, she's taking examples of things that occurred under the Trump administration, and she's identifying those as being along the path to fascism. And I'm not saying this or raising this with you because I agree with her. She's completely off base, lunatic level silly in her assessment of the steps to fascism. Like, she takes in the argument that Trump supposedly said great people on both sides in talking about the battle about whether or not to remove statues of Civil War leaders, the Southern Civil War leaders. And then she used springboards from that lie and says, and therefore, this is how it fits in. So she has 10 steps to fascism. I disagree with her assessment across the board. Her thinking is right that the conduct that she is identifying as steps toward fascism, they're correct concepts, but her application is this left-wing worldview that is disconnected from reality. But the reason I'm raising her today in the first 5 and in this discussion about tyranny today is that her 10th element, the step to fascism, the final step, she is saying we are there as Americans. And her criticism, her example of why we're at this 10th step toward fascism that she wrote about. I think she wrote the book 20 years ago or something. But step 10 is subvert the rule of law and replace it with martial or military law. So her 10 steps of fascism, 10th one, she says, is subvert the rule of law, replace it with martial or military law. But then she's saying, and we're there. We are there right now. America's there. And what she's talking about is the government's policies, draconian policies under COVID. Much as she's a leftist, and she has all sorts of, I'm telling you, lunatic, in my view, lunatic level assessment of incidents in American history that she's tying to her 10 steps to fascism. But she is now saying, actually, the 10th step, this whole subverting the rule of law, bringing in military control, we're there. And she's pointing a finger at the policies that we have in America, accepted and put in place and accepted and pretty much submitted to under COVID. So she's she's an interesting character. And I'll wrap up the first 5 by saying, I think it's a little bit of a potential eye-opening thing for Americans who are leftists, who kind of love Obama and love Clinton, love Gore, love all those people, to hear someone who they would hold in high regard, this Naomi Wolf. They would think she's quite a thinker. She's an intellect, but as I say, she's so left-wing, and that what she writes now about what constitutes steps towards fascism are just disconnected from reality. She accepts false premises, she accepts a left-wing worldview, left-wing presentation of facts, and then fits them into her fascism list. But even Naomi Wolf is telling America's leftists and everybody else who will listen that we are approaching the 10th step toward fascism. In fact, she's saying we're here, and it's time for the American people to stand up and recognize we're going to be facing tyranny. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. And that, my very fine friends, is today's first 5. So I want to talk about examples when I say tyranny, media, speech, banks, and schools. I actually should have added another one. Media, speech, banks, and schools, and elections. And I'm going to start with the election piece. And when I say tyranny, I did the introduction to try to talk about the idea this is not the kind of tyranny with Nazis knocking your door down, or the governments of any Marxist, socialist, communist country that are endlessly repressing their people, that are endlessly dictating the lives of the people, that are limiting them and their personal freedom in across the board, in their speech, in their religion, in their work, in their education. Everything about the lives of individuals is ultimately controlled by government. When you live under Marxism, socialism, communism, it is essentially always tyranny. America is supposed to be different from that because we have these rights in the Constitution, and we have the premise of ordered society, limited government, and the premise that came from the very founding of America, the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal and endowed by our Creator with inalienable rights, including life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. And we have those rights because we were born. Not because we belonged to any political class, not because our grandfather was somebody wealthy, not because of skin color, race, ethnicity, national origin, but because we exist, because we were born, we're a child of God, we have these rights inherently. And that's a big difference in all the rest of the world. But I want to talk about where we are already on the road to tyranny in America under what has now become the Democrat Marxist Party. The Democrat Party today is not your grandfather's Democrat Party. They have wholeheartedly embraced socialism and Marxism, and their policies embrace these ideas. Their policies are based on these ideas. I often say it's one of the few good things I can say about Bernie Sanders. At least he's an honest communist. He just tells you who he is. Democrat socialist is a nice, he thinks it's a milder term. The guy's a communist, and the policies he proposes are communist, but at least he's honest. The Democrat Party has tried to play the line to the American people. Yeah, we got Bernie Sanders over there at AOC, but they're not really running things, and they're kind of extreme. We're on the American playing field. And as I've been saying for years now, the Democrat Party is not on the American playing field, but is getting serious in our country because we now have complete Democrat Marxist control over the entire federal government. I want to give you numerous examples of why I say that. This is tyranny in our faces. To start with, we mentioned, in fact, I guess that was Tuesday, when Bob McEwen joined us in studio. He's based in Washington. I don't know. Actually, he's based several places, I guess. Washington, Florida, but he is a profound thinker, a renowned public speaker. I was so grateful. I knew he was going to be in Dallas for a meeting that evening when I got him to come to the studio. One thing we talked about that day was the H.R. 1 bill, which is pending in Congress. And H.R. 1 relates to legislation in which the federal government is proposing to take over the entire election system of America. The Constitution says that state legislatures make laws relating to the elections in their respective states. That's not the exact language, but the Constitution, clear as a bell, says state legislatures do this. Congress is using, the Democrat-controlled Congress is using the false premise of the 14th Amendment and the need to protect against possible discrimination. This is the constitutional basis for why they say they claim they have the right to do this, to completely take over every single election in America. To pass a federal law that will mandate to the states every possible anything you know about that is election integrity, that is a statute or a practice in states that preserves election integrity. All of that wiped off the table, all of it gone. The federal government is trying to move forward to say we're going to completely destroy election integrity. No states may pass election integrity laws, and in their place, the federal government runs it all, rigging the rules, taxpayer dollars. I could run through a whole host of the examples of the kind of things in this legislation. But, we talked about in the show many times in California, how they just have a ballot harvesting frenzy every election. They have ballot harvesting that permits people to show up at a nursing home and come back with a handful of ballots, and they all get counted. There's no figuring out who cast these ballots. Who is this person who brought in 27 ballots? I mean, it is a free-for-all for cheaters in California. This federal law would make that the practice, would mandate that be the practice in every state. So you have ballot harvesting extravaganza. You have requiring states to permit same-day registration and voting. So no way till much later say, hey, wait a minute, you registered to vote, but you're a citizen of Venezuela. What are you doing here? Elections long over. So it is setting up elections to mandate that illegal aliens and others with no legal right to vote will get to vote. So it's getting rid of voter ID. No voter ID, that's considered racist. They have same-day voting. They have a very extended period for early voting, which is, as we discovered in the 2020 election cycle, the playground for election fraud. I could go on, but I don't want to dwell on this one particular aspect too long. But H.R. 1 needs to be seen by Americans as an aspect of the tyranny that has now taken over our country. This is absolute evisceration of fair elections. It is a permanent Democrat majority election law that will never, ever allow the victory of Republicans in elections again. It is that onerous, it is that extreme, and as I used the word when Bob McEwen was here, it is that audacious. It is audacious beyond description. Second example, and I'm going to run through all these: media, speech, banks, and schools. And so, speaking of audacity or brazenness, absolute brazenness, 2 Democrat members of the U.S. Congress wrote a letter this week to the chief executive officers of the country's largest television producers. So they're writing to television producers, bullying them, trying to tell them they need to purge Fox News, Newsmax, and OAN, or One America News Network, OANN. These are not like some slimy goofball, Occupy Wall Street ignoramuses, hanging out in street corners. This is 2 members of the United States Congress. The audacity, they're saying that the conservative message actually has outlets in which the American people get to hear the conservative message, and they are saying there's nothing short of tyrannical. There's no word good enough. Tyrannical. They're deciding, because they have power, they're going to try to shut down the very few remaining networks that any conservative wants to listen to, that any conservative has a possibility of getting their voice out on. They are saying, they're trying to arm twist these television producers, the chief executive officers of our nation's largest television producers, and telling them, you got to get rid of these. Just these people are out. They cannot be allowed. They're demanding the providers explain the steps they took following November 3rd. They're on a mission to say, and this is elected Democrats saying, you need television producers, you need to shut down these conservative source of news. Can't be allowed to have them. Audacious on its face, almost unbelievable. I mean, if someone had told you, let me say it the opposite way. When Republicans had the majority, in 2017, we had the White House, the Senate, and the House were all Republican controlled. It would be like the Republicans introducing a bill saying, we demand, or pushing through a process, through letters, we demand that CNN, MSNBC, CBS, ABC, NBC, all of the left-wing media be shut down. That is the equivalent. And of course, the left always uses the excuse, it's not because we're trying to silence, our political opponents. It's because they put out misinformation. They put things out there that aren't true, and then people believe this misinformation. So to leftists, misinformation is anything they don't want you to know, anything they are disputing. So people want to talk about issues like election integrity, and that this is one of the things that they're saying, no, can't have that conversation happening, shut them down. I also want to another aspect, another way that they are doing this, which I find simply mind-blowing. The Democrats are trying to push in Washington. They are trying to reinstate a policy under the Obama era called Operation Choke Point that relates to banks. So back in the Obama era, and I think before many people were awake to recognizing what a radical Marxist he was and is, the Obama administration, in an effort to punish the officials they didn't like, punish the organizations that they oppose, like the NRA, organizations that oppose anyone the left doesn't like, the Obama team put in place, again, under the guise of, this is for safety, this is to help the American people, this is to make the American people feel safe, this is why it's okay to do this. We're not doing this to fight our political enemies, we're doing this because everyone should want the NRA shut down. We're trying to protect the American people. So they put in place something called Operation Checkpoint. Choke Point, C-H-O-K-E, Choke Point, with the idea they're telling these banks that they want the banks to stop doing business with organizations the left doesn't like. And they were gun sellers, pawn shops, short-term money lenders. Blatantly unconstitutional, blatantly outrageous, an absolute, without question, effort of the Obama team to use their power, because they have it. Leftists will always use the power they have to tell banks that they need to not permit the NRA, gun sellers, pawn shops, to be able to use the bank services. So you can't have banking. If you can't have banking, you can barely have an entity. So Choke Point, put in place by Obama years ago, Trump administration came along and said, wait a minute, this is not constitutional. Note, the Trump administration did not grab onto the rule, the Operation Choke Point rule, and apply it to their political enemies. They did the right thing, the highest thing, the American idea. The Trump team said, we're not going to do this. You can't do this. And they actually got rid of the rule. And then toward the end of his term, the Officer of the Comptroller of the Currency established the fair access rule about banks, basically saying government can't be telling banks who gets to have an account, who gets to do banking services. So Trump team fixes it, puts it back on track in the American playing field. And now the Biden team, on January 28th, I think it was, the Office of the Comptroller announced that they are pausing the Trump era rule, the Fair Access rule, and they're reconsidering Operation Choke Point. And I want to mention something else about how tyrannical this is. The left always uses the argument that we're not fighting our enemies. We're trying to keep the American people safe. Everyone knows we have too many guns in this country. Everyone knows gun sellers are a problem. Everyone knows pawn shops do bad things. So they get an argument out to the American people that sounds like they're doing some policy because they're trying to keep things safe, trying to keep things fair. And they get leftists in this country who don't think very deeply about what will happen to our country to hear things like this and not get offended. I mean, their concept is, well, the American people will hear this. You'd think some people would say, hey, wait a minute, you can't just, cut out banking for gun shops. But you get a lot of people saying, well, that's probably a good idea. I don't like gun shops. I wouldn't go to a gun shop. Why should gun shops get to be able to use banks? They get unthinking American people behind their onerous, treasonous, tyrannical policies by convincing them that they're actually on the right side of some issue. And so you have people in America who'd probably say, well, I don't really care if the banks won't let the NRA have an account. You could actually probably get some significant chunk of Americans saying that because they aren't thinking deeply enough about freedom in America. Another thing I was going to mention, we've talked about in the show before, but I'll briefly mention it again. So the Biden administration is talking about revising the domestic terror definitions, the domestic terror definitions and regulations to include people who challenge the election outcome of 2020, who speak and say, I think I have a problem with election 2020. That is something that the Biden administration is pushing, which is clearly saying, we're going to fight our political enemies. You're going to get told you can't say anything we don't like. We're going to shut you down from even conversing about whether there was election fraud in 2020, what was the real outcome, what happened. This is the left saying, because we have the power, we will. We're going to call people challenging election 2020 domestic terrorists. Another example in this segment, kind of running through, and there are many, many more, but kind of running through the idea of what we're seeing is blatant, unabashed, brazen tyranny coming out of the federal government. And this one has to do, the government hasn't done it yet, but where they're headed in having the left in America so emboldened, they're headed down these kind of paths. So a group of LGBTQ advocates, not just one group, but many organizations who support the LGBTQ agenda, got together and they are pressing Congress. A series of LGBT groups are pressing Congress, long as the Democrat Marxists are in control, to take away the accreditation of any public or private or religious school that teaches traditional marriage as marriage, that does not fully embrace the LGBTQ agenda with respect to marriage, with respect to gender identity, with respect to transgenderism. This group is saying, hey, now's our time. Let's use our power, our leftist Marxist power in Washington, to bring about the losing accreditation for any school who may, for example, stand on biblical principles and say that marriage is between a man and a woman. It's not enough. It's not that they're saying we want to make sure schools acknowledge that not everyone, embraces the Judeo-Christian teaching about marriage. They're not just saying we want to be sure that, children learn something about the LGBTQ agenda or the LGBTQ lifestyle, or children are taught, they're not pushing to include more things being taught in schools. They're pushing to tell America and America's teachers and America's school children and America's parents, nobody gets to teach traditional American values about marriage. They must be banned or you lose your accreditation as a school. Now, this has not happened yet. This is just an agenda item. But it gets to this point, I'm talking about tyranny today. The idea of tyranny, just the other side has no voice, has no right to speak, has no legal recourse to do anything. This is where we're headed in America today. And this is why it's so dangerous that we had the Biden administration sworn in January of this year, 2021, and why we have absolute control of the federal government being held by the Democrat Marxist left. Because if they have their way in 2 years, we'll have no more free and fair elections again. We'll have H.R. 1, meaning the federal government controls every aspect of elections. We'll have schools shut down because if you're not accredited, people don't want to send their kids there because the kid's going to finish school. They can't get into the college they want to go to. Accreditation allows students to move forward in life after school. So school accreditation matters to them. So you have schools being told, you know what, easier to surrender, fine, whatever they want us to teach, whatever they say is fine with us. It is the bullying of the left is simply mind-blowing. In elections, in schools, in the media, the left emboldened to be trying to tell America which news outlets are allowed to be run, allowed to be aired, allowed to be heard. And folks, nothing that I'm telling you is being done under the radar. I mean, the level of emboldenment, I don't know if that's really a word, but it should be, emboldenment, that they are emboldened by the stridency of the left, by the determination to get everything done they can through legislation, through regulation, through just any means possible, through getting court decisions to permanently seal the leftist takeover of America so that no Republican will ever be elected again to anything, to any of any prominence. No conservative value can be voiced in public. No conservative values can be taught to children. This is a pure evisceration of the culture of America. I could go on for the rest of the week about this, but I'm getting at the point today to wrap up this segment. This is tyranny on steroids right in front of our faces. And I always tell you, and I will continue to tell you, I will never give up on America. There are things you can be doing. Every time you communicate with your member of Congress, your 2 U.S. senators, your state rep, your state senator, your governor, your mayor, speaking up, talking not just about the policy you don't like, the vote you hope they will cast, or the vote you're asking them not to cast, but also the larger message, encouraging more people to wake up and recognize America the free is under direct, profound assault, and every patriot, every lover of freedom better be on board fighting. 2 more quick topics today. The COVID budget. I started to mention when we had Bob McEwen on the show 2 days ago. I started to mention about the COVID budget busters, and there was so much there, and we were near the end of the show, and then he chimed in with something. So anyway, I just want to hit some numbers. I meant to have a slide ready for you. I meant to have it because it's easier to follow these things in a slide. I may create the slide and put it up later at our website, but I'm just going to tell you a couple things. So this is the COVID bill to help people who are suffering because the businesses have been shut down. The COVID bill is supposed to be to help Americans suffering under COVID lockdowns. As you recall, President Trump, happy to negotiate, offered work with Nancy Pelosi to get something done on that, and she would not play ball. She knew that she had a golden opportunity for legislation that had to be passed, and she was going to wait and hope that she had a Democrat majority in the House and the Senate and a Democrat in the White House, and she was going to push through the most massive spending bill comprehensible. It isn't comprehensible, it's so huge. The most massive spending bill, and she had to have something that made it okay for her to do that. So she held off, would not send the COVID relief she could have sent, waited till now, and she, Pelosi, and Schumer have cooked up a deal almost beyond description. But I'll tell you quick, so it's 1.9 trillion. 1.9 trillion with a T. Can't even comprehend that number. Is the COVID relief bill. Leaving aside, I mentioned, I think earlier today or yesterday, there's still $1 trillion previously authorized for COVID relief and not spent. We still could use all that money. But no, you have Nancy Pelosi and her Democrat majority. They have a bill, 1.9 trillion. And I want to make something really clear about this. Of this 1.9 trillion, Only $825 billion is actually related to COVID relief. All the rest of this is the Democrats' spending wish list, the wild, out of control spending. And you have to believe many conservatives in Washington are trying to challenge it. Many are trying to figure out how to challenge it. I believe this will go to the floor tomorrow to be voted upon. And obviously, with the slim majorities the House of the Democrats have in the House and the Senate, maybe you pick off a few people, but this is a catastrophic, you can't even find adequate adjectives. And I love words. I love thinking about adjectives that are fitting. You can't even find that to fit what this bill is. So understand, first of all, so out of basically $2 trillion, it's 1.9, basically $2 trillion, only $825 billion is actually related to COVID relief. I'll tell you some of the other gems that are in there. I mentioned yesterday or Tuesday, $1 billion in payments to socially disadvantaged farmers, $500 million to art museums, tens of millions to Planned Parenthood, other abortion providers, $100 million for an underground rail system in San Jose, California, that won't be finished till 2030. But hey, I mean the number. I want to run through some of these others because you just have to realize how preposterous this bill is. I mean, it's funny money. They can print the money. They can claim they have it, but pretty soon, at some point, the chickens will come home to roost. There won't be the money to pay for this. It's just funny money. They could be playing with monopoly money. It's that absurd. Here are some other ones. $1.5 million earmarked for the Seaway International Bridge to connect New York and Canada. Senator Schumer, big advocate of this, he's all thrilled about that. $50 million for family planning, which simply means Planned Parenthood and other similar organizations. $825 for AmeriCorps Vista, National Senior Service, things like that. It does give, out of all that money, $473 billion is actually going to account for the money going to individuals. Out of $2 trillion, $473 billion goes to actual payments to people because of losses due to COVID. $825 billion total to COVID-related things. $200 million to the Institute of Museum and Library Services. $270 million for the National Endowment of the Arts and Humanities, which should be eliminated, in my opinion. And this is a key one. I could read. I could go on the rest of the show. I want to read you one more. $350 billion to bail out the 50 states and the District of Columbia. You might say, okay, well, at least that's, because everyone suffered under COVID, at least it's going to everybody. But it is among the most onerous provisions of all of this because it's rewarding the blue state governors and the blue state mayors and other leaders who shut their states down unnecessarily in a draconian fashion, extended shutdowns unnecessarily. So they lost more money because more people were unemployed and had to seek unemployment, had to seek help. So essentially, the red states are covering for the blue states. The red states that opened up sooner, that had people back at work, that didn't have the draconian shutdowns, we're covering for, I'm from Texas, the red states are covering for the blue states. So just as a quick example, the allocation formula, so it isn't like $350 billion divided among 50 states and the District of Columbia equally by population or something. It's not like that. The formula involves the unemployment rate. The unemployment rate in the fourth quarter of 2020. So states that shut down and stay shut down, like New York, California, that had strict economic lockdown policies, high unemployment, they get the bail money. States like Florida and South Dakota that stayed open for business, they'll get less. This also, in this COVID relief